the intentions were aligned for both Zionists and Nazis. They wanted the Jews out of Germany, out of Europe, and the Zionists wanted them shipped to Palestine, right? I mean, that's pretty irrefutable.
Yes, it's irrefutable. They were aligned in the fact that they both wanted the same thing, which was to basically get the Jews out of the country. And that's also what culminated in that transfer agreement. That's one of the significant factors behind that, which was between 1933 and 1939. I mean, I recently found, and this was quite mind-blowing, that 60% of all the investment into Jewish Palestine, so specifically going to the Jewish economy, was coming directly from Nazi Germany.
Welcome to Far Out with Faust, everybody. I am Faust Chicho, and I am joined once again by my brother, Gavin Nascimento. We are here. We're going to bring it right back to where we left off. Let me remind you who this man is. He is an intelligence analyst of the highest order. He's a conspiracy realist. He's known for his incredible attention to detail and adherence to facts. He does not deal in theories. He sticks to what can be proved by evidence, and his reputation and following reflects that. Gavin, thank you so much for beaming in, brother, from around the world. It's great to have you back again.
It is an honor and it is a pleasure, brother. I'm looking forward to it. I managed to put together a couple of slides, some very relevant ones, because the topic is a difficult one to believe unless you've looked into it personally. So naturally, to make it more digestible, I've made sure to include some very, very strong sources and citations.
Absolutely. And I was just reading more about this, and it's very, very difficult for people to digest because it is the definition of an antithesis. It's oxymoronic in every way. How can Zionists, and why would they ever be in league with a fascist Nazi party, right? I mean, that question is mind-boggling, and most people cannot reconcile it. But particularly in the beginning, as we've laid out in previous podcasts together, they were aligned in their desire to get the Jewish people out of Europe and into Palestine. And I think that much is, that's almost irrefutable. You can say, oh, they were never in business together, even though they were. But all you have to do is look at the intentions of both. And how can you, this is before, everything went into, mass murder and chaos in Germany. This was the 30s I'm talking about, right? The intentions were aligned for both Zionists and Nazis. They wanted the Jews out of Germany, out of Europe, and the Zionists wanted them shipped to Palestine, right? I mean, that's pretty irrefutable.
But while you were talking, I was also just looking up the sources and citations, because I've been focusing more heavily on the involvement of specifically the Rothschild family and the Warburg family, because it's explosive. But in relation to what you're saying, the documentary evidence regarding that is actually much easier to find than the topics of the Rothschild involvement and the Warburg involvement. And yes, it's irrefutable. They were aligned in the fact that they both wanted the same thing, which was to basically get the Jews out of the country. And that's also what culminated in that transfer agreement. That's one of the significant factors behind that, which was between 1933 and 1939. I mean, I recently found, and this was quite mind-blowing, that 60% of all the investment into Jewish Palestine, so specifically going to the Jewish economy, was coming directly from Nazi Germany through that agreement. And what that agreement was, just so everybody knows, just to give a quick summation, I think we may have even touched on it prior, but it was basically a deal where the Zionists and Arthur Rupin, who was a eugenist, and he actually was in close contact with a prominent Nazi racial scientist, another eugenist, and he was a significant figure. He was one of the key figures, him and David Ben-Gurion, who was kind of one of his students, and he was the first, they consider him to be the founding prime minister, right? But during that, what the whole plan was, it wasn't so much as it's kind of put forward speciously today that, it was about saving the Jews from Germany, because Hitler very famously said he would if he could just get the other countries to take the Jewish people, that's why they call it the final solution, because it was the last solution.
Mm-hmm.
The prior so-called solutions was, he said very infamously and famously, and this is not me vouching for Hitler, because he is, this is a ridiculous propaganda that he's always a savior, which is completely ridiculous.
Yeah.
The dude was insane. He was just as crazy as the rest of them.
Yep.
But there's a lot of propaganda surrounding a particular topic. So he's not a good dude. That's not what I'm trying to say here. But objective reality, and therefore the truth, is the truth. And he famously said he would actually put the Jews on a first-class ticket on a boat just to get them out of Germany to any country that would take them.
And he meant it.
Yeah, no, he did. It was the fact that all these countries weren't taking in the immigrants, and that the nation or the Zionists in Palestine was so virulently fixated on only having Jews come to Palestine and nowhere else. They're not allowed to go to anywhere else. They have to come to Palestine, which was having immigration restrictions. I mean, this just is a lot to unpack there. But he famously said this. So the transfer agreement wasn't about saving the Jews. It wasn't about getting them out there. It was about getting the capital and the wealth, because at that time, the Jewish colonies financially were in dire straits. And they actually came up with a very clever plan where they came up with a liquidation bank. And what was going to happen is, to kind of unpack, how does this make sense?
Was it the Dutch bank?
There was a Nazi boycott. No, it wasn't a Dutch bank. I can't remember specifically what it was.
What do they call it?
Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank. No, I can't remember specifically which one it was, to be honest with you. But they did work in cooperation with one of the local banks in Palestine. And it was very clever how they did it. So they basically said, look, we will have these immigrants. So the Nazis were faced with an international boycott on their goods, and this was hurting the economy. So
and
the deal was
this was instigated by the Jewish, basically the
Zionists, yeah.
The Zionists.
And interestingly, they would have continued with that relationship even longer had the Nazis not put an end to it sooner. So, and this went up until 1939, when World War II had already broken out. The Jewish persecutions were very clear. And so there was this international boycott. It was hurting the Nazi economy economically in a very serious way. Some historians, they contend that this could have potentially been the end of the Nazi party. Now, I think there's a lot more to be said about that. I wouldn't go that far. But it put them in a position where they were. They had dire straits. Maybe that could have been the collapse of the party. We don't know, of course, because it never went that route. Instead, what the Zionists came up with, led by Arthur Rupin, who was very calculated. Remember, this is an Ashkenazi Jewish supremacist. So he believed in Ashkenazi supremacy. And they came up with this idea, very clever and calculated, where knowing, because he was all about having these settlements, about the Jewish economy, he was involved in everything. He had his fingers in many proverbial pies. What they came up with was the idea that, yes, we'll help you break the boycott, and what we'll do is we'll purchase the goods, and then we'll sell those goods in Palestine and abroad, and then we'll take the excess income of that. Right, so that's kind of how it was done. It was a reciprocal relationship. So we'll purchase the goods now that there's a boycott on, and we'll help to also break the international boycott. I mean, they did insane things to break this boycott. They completely undermined other Jewish leaders. Like, Zionism was not a popular movement, and so they came up with this liquidation bank concept. And the way that it worked was only once the Jews got to Palestine physically. Only once they got there physically would they get their money, and that money would also be taxed by the government, by the Jewish government in Palestine. Yes, and now if you didn't, because part of the plan was they couldn't have all the immigrants come directly to Palestine, so some of them had to first go through America or England or some other country. Knowing that once the Jews went to these countries, they're going to obviously settle there because it's way better than what Palestine was.
Right.
They made the stipulation that unless they still make the trip all the way to Palestine, those funds would be forfeited into the local Jewish governments in Palestine. So it wasn't just, we're going to go save the Jews. And you know what I mean? It was just cynical politics, man.
I mean, it's funny. I posted that video I sent you, and people are like, well, of course. This was an attempt to save, like, some, clever and Machiavellian attempt to actually save Jews. I was like, really? Okay. but what about, and I'm like, I'm reading about 1925, I'm sorry, November 25th, 1940, a boat called the Patra. I don't know if you ever read about this, carrying Jewish refugees. It exploded and sunk off the coast of Palestine, killing 252 people, right? And this boat, the Patra, was headed to Mauritius, or how do you say that? Mauritius?
Mauritius,
Mauritius.
Mauritius, yeah.
And the Jewish Hagna initially claimed that the passengers committed suicide to protest the alleged British refusal to allow them to disembark there. The Hagna later admitted that they blew up the vessel rather than allow it to get to Mauritius. At a 1958 memorial service for the 252 people who died on the Patra, former Israeli Prime Minister Moshe Sharett tried to justify the Zionists' mass murder of innocent Jewish people by explaining, and I quote, "Sometimes it is necessary to sacrifice the few in order to save the many." How fucking foobar is that? I mean, but that speaks volumes.
And this kind of ethos and ideology has dominated the leadership, man. Where whether it was the politicians on the so-called left or the right, they were united in their virulent allegiance to statism and an oligarchy. So for them, the state was what came first, no matter what. That's why David Ben Gurion also very famously had that quote when there was an operation on part of the British government to rescue 10,000 children, Jewish children from Germany. And when I think I mentioned this before, and then when he heard about this, rather than saying, "Wow, that's amazing and that's so fantastic," but this dude goes ahead and says, he said, "If it was up to me, and I could have England save all the Jewish children in Germany from their persecution and this horrible fate that likely is going to await them, or only have half of them come to Palestine, I would choose the second option." Because essentially he's viewing it as the significance of this greater story and the significance of having a Jewish state. And he became a massive totalitarian when there was supposed to be, after the Declaration of Independence, when you're supposed to come up with a constitution, right, collectively, like in a democratic fashion.
Right.
He suspended that, and he took like absolute control.
Wow.
But that's the story, man, and this is why it's so important for people to remove the religious excrement from this equation. But unfortunately, in order to do that, it likely requires not just psychological strength, but for them to actually question not just their understanding of reality, but on a deeper level, because our sense of identity is attached to our sense of reality. And we were talking about the Matrix before we came on air. Who in Neo, he sees the truth, right? All I'm showing you is the truth, is what Morpheus said. He says, "Remember, all I'm going to show you is the truth." And then when he sees it, he starts to freak out. He says, "I don't believe it. I don't believe it." And he falls on his knees and he throws up and he passes out. It's obviously a very simple analogy for what happens when you become disillusioned. It's difficult. It's profoundly difficult. And that's why a lot of people don't want to undergo that difficult process.
It's easier to say everyone else is wrong, or
100%, man. Like it's been attributed to Blaise Pascal, great quote, always use it. "It is man's natural sickness to believe that he alone possesses the truth."
Yeah. And there's not one of us who is not guilty of that. That's for sure.
100%, man. It's part of, I think, mental sanity. You have to feel like you know what's going on,
Yeah, man. But to be able to extricate yourself just enough to try to look objectively. And that's proving to be a very difficult thing, particularly for people who have not only a religious, but an ethnic and, an entire, it's like if it's one thing, you can see the ability sometimes to step back. But when it's so many things and the indoctrination is so thoroughly braided around their identity, it's very difficult. It's very difficult, and that's just the way. I don't know if there's any getting around that. A lot of people will remain in denial, and other people are going to detach and say, "I'm Jewish. This is apartheid. This is genocide. I see what's happening." Some people are secure enough, or I should say maybe not quite indoctrinated to the degree that they can step back and say, "You know what? I don't want this to be my identity anymore. I see what's happening and I'm not going to," I think It has to do with a lot of things, but not much we can do about it besides, discuss what we have discovered, and found to be true, and leave religion and different God's favorite. Somebody wrote on my comments, that's Israel's God's favorite country. I was like, really? What was God's favorite country before 1948? And they were like, well, what I meant was God's favorite people. And I was like, oh, okay. I was like, you think God has favorite people? Really? I don't know if I agree with that. I think all God's people are his favorite. Oh man, people are fucking unbelievable. But let's get into it, brother. Where do we leave off?
Before we do get into it, I was just going through some of my folders, and what I've dug up very quickly, just to corroborate what we were talking about earlier, and this is from Professor Francis Nicosia, so it's not a controversial figure to cite, but it's basically where Germany, the German government, persuaded what was its ally then, the Ottoman Empire, to reopen, to reverse, there was this pre-war opposition to the idea of large-scale Jewish settlements in Palestine. It's from a publication entitled Zionism and Anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany by Professor Nicosia Francis. It's page 47. And it's very easy to go look up, guys. Just go to archive.org. Okay, let's rock and roll. So you want to just jump into it, Jay?
Yeah, and I'll make sure this is edited in for everyone to see.
Okay, cool, man. This leads us obviously to the Rothschild family. Now, I'll refer people to the previous podcast we did, in which we established their major, massive, insurmountable, mountainous influence in the development of Palestine, specifically Baron Edmund de Rothschild, who was actually viewed, I only learned this recently, he was recognized and rumored to be the richest of all of the siblings. So he made some good investments in Palestine, it would appear. He wasn't relegated to Palestine alone, but he was heavily involved in it. And of course, he's recognized as being the father of Palestinian colonization, which is huge. It's a very big thing. And he's in the background, he's always there. He's involved with the banks. He's involved with the land purchases.
Put him on the money for 5 years. I made it on. Put it on the cover of the.
Yeah, and he looks just like the architect of the Matrix. Yeah. And the interesting thing is, the family, even to this day, are heavily involved in the state of Israel. Oh, yeah. They built the Knesset Parliament, which is like the equivalent of the White House. They built that building. They built the Supreme Court building. They developed the first public broadcasting, which is called Israeli Educational Television. Mm-hmm. And through that, they have basically used it as a means to indoctrinate the population. I went through some of the programming that they have. They had this one particular program on, it was a child's, because of course the children are the best to get to, mm-hmm. where it's about a cactus. And the analogy is, I guess in Israel, there's this term that's used to designate native-born Israelis, right? And then they're supposed to be hard on the outside, but on the inside they're soft and sweet. And so this helped to inculcate the sense of ideology. Remember in the previous podcast when we spoke about a new Jew, right? The new, strong, muscular Judaism. And that has been personified through the modern state of Israel, mandatory military service, and so on and so forth. So it was a huge social project, and they had a social engineering project, and they had a massive hand in that. But with that said, what about their influence, their potential influence in working with Nazi Germany? Yeah. And this is where we're going to break out some slides, because it's very difficult to believe this, right? So let me first say this. They had a company called Benito, and Benito was getting its oil from the Russian Empire. This is why in the previous podcast we spoke about the fact that they were in fact giving money to the Russian Tsar Alexander III, in spite of the fact that those pogroms and persecutions of Jews are the actual reason why there was large-scale immigration to Palestine in the late 1800s in the first place.
That's right.
So it's not just Nazi Germany. There's a weird link there too with Tsar Alexander III, and this was a company, Benito. Okay, and somebody can go to the old podcast where I showed the screen so they can see the source on that particular claim.
And you also had Jews leaving Russia and fleeing into Germany.
They went everywhere. Yeah, look, they went everywhere. They didn't just go to Palestine. Yeah. And it's very interesting, man.
Welcomed into Germany at that time. I mean, there was a lot of. I mean,
to understand why Nazism grew into what it did and why it got so crazy, one has to understand what happened in World War One,
That's right.
and also eugenics, because in World War One, the reality is, the objective reality is that the German people were thrown under the bus big time, man. They
Yeah,
actually,
sold out.
they actually sought to um, pursue peace. They actually offered peace terms
right.
when they had the upper hand at one point.
They had the war won. I mean,
Yeah.
it was game set match. It was
Yeah.
there was no competition because, again, the Germans' technology with their submarines just was light years above everyone else. Again, incredible how the Germans did with both wars. You know, the technology they had was mind blowing. It ended up being mind blowing. And so, absolutely, there was, and in this kind of, it was a very, very, you know, even I think Britain and that they were a little bit shocked by it. I mean, Germany is their neighbor, but they were offering them basically a peace deal that would have reset them back to
Well, they
before
basically
the
said
war.
just go to have things how it was before. Yeah,
Yeah,
basically that's kind of what it was. And it wasn't just this; it was the fact that the propaganda. Anybody that's researched the propaganda, it's an excellent case study in literal fake news and how dangerous governments can be in getting people to hate one another. There was this propaganda about like the Beast of Berlin, and there was anti-German sentiment, specifically in America. It was so virulent around the world that they began to rename things that had traditionally been German. So a hamburger became a Liberty sandwich. Um, uh, the dog, a German Shepherd, became an Alsatian. They ensured that you could no longer teach German at the schools, which was a big deal because their biggest immigrant population in the U.S., for example, was German. There were people that were taught and fed that a guy was hung because he was German, you know, and
yeah,
people just were incensed. And this was also around the advent. It's very interesting to study as well. But Hollywood, this is where it really got its start, was by working with the government and producing propaganda films. And so this had an especially evocative effect on people that had not been familiar with how films work and how powerful that is to captivate you emotionally, biologically, and really plug you into their proverbial matrix. Now, what happened with Germany, on the other hand, which horrible things happened there, man. One of the most terrible things that's overlooked during World War One, and people need to understand this is pre-Nazi era. This is what resulted in the Nazi era.
yeah,
And Hitler was in fact a soldier during this period. And what happened was there was these horrible sanctions, which is where you don't let certain foods and medicines get into a country. And the politicians are never the ones to really suffer for this because they're well off. They got cash, they got money, they got supplies. It's going to be the common people. And so it's estimated, and people should look this up just to fact check because it's been a long time since I've looked into this specific topic, but about 60,000 people died as a result of this. Then from there, they were really harsh and imposing and irrational sanctions and fines and war reparations placed on the German economy and the German people. And of course, this is one of the great tragedies of how the parasite class works: is they wage war. And you must remember now the German Kaiser, which we also addressed in one of our previous podcasts, the German Kaiser, which is translated into Caesar, the Russian Tsar, which is also translated into Caesar, and the British King were all cousins. But now all the common people are going to fight one another, kill one another. And then when it's done, because they instigated this madness, and it goes beyond them, of course, then we have to fit the bill. And so there was a terrible depression in Germany. It was very, very bad. The unemployment was super, super high. The people were beaten down. And there were indeed economic exploiters. In fact, one of the Warburg family members, which we'll get into later, by the name of Max Warburg, he was over the Reichsbank. And there was also a plan in Wall Street, the Dawes and Young plan, which they were slowly actually building up Nazi Germany. But there was this massive plan in place where they were exploiting the country. Now it began to emerge through ideologies get adapted, they get interpreted differently. Whenever you have a country or people that feel deeply repressed, they are going to gravitate towards something radical eventually. It's going to produce some kind of radicalism because
Donald
that's
Trump.
the natural expression. 100%.
You could call
man.
him radical, but that's what his popularity.
Well, in relation to the potential options that are available,
Yeah.
There's much better options available than that. You can have a refined truth speaker. You can have somebody that genuinely wants
Right.
to create a better world. There's a lot of people on this planet, boys and girls.
Oh,
You don't have to
absolutely.
go with Donald Trump or old
I'm just
man
saying, in
Biden.
2016, everyone didn't realize that the sentiment was going to be swayed towards him because he represented, at least for the public, the only thing that resembled something out of the box and
Well,
radical.
100%, man. Even now
Yeah.
with this whole woke ideology, this kind of woke culture that's being promoted, this notion is nothing new.
No.
You know, Professor Anthony Sutton details in his publication, I think was Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, aside from the fact that the same powerful clique, the Rockefellers, J.P. Morgan, and so on and so forth, aside from the fact that they built up, that they are the very force behind the Bolshevik Communist Revolution, so the radical left. Aside from them doing that, it's also noted in something called the Marburg Plan that this could be utilized as a strategy than to have an equal and opposite, just as far right reaction. And you can
Mm-hmm.
control both. You know, the best way to control the outcome of a conflict is to literally control both sides. And they've done this throughout history. I mean, I detail
Yep.
this meticulously in my publication, A History of Elitism with Government and Population Control. So I don't want to go on about that too much.
Yeah.
And
Buy his book, everyone.
yeah, check it out, man. It's
a great book.
First of all, it's the knowledge there will fast track your research, and the sources are insane. Like I went over the top with the sources because I understand how explosive the information is. And then the second thing is you can help support my work, and that'll allow me to continue to do my research. And of course, I've got no fear, and I definitely have unique capabilities which allow me to dig up some stuff that we haven't seen before. And let's get into some of that right now.
And
Right?
you can find the link to his book in the video description of this podcast if you're watching it on Rumble or YouTube. And there's a way to include links in. It'll be copy and pasted into the iTunes and the rest of them as well.
Yes, and just very quickly before we do move forward, I actually lost my track of thought there. Let me do a quick rebound and recovery. And then with World War One, between this repression that was taking place and then the rise of the eugenics movement, right? Because that's what people always forget. Eugenics is what underlied the Nazi programs of persecution. First, it started with sterilizations, and then it became the final, so the last solution, the last option in their eyes. That was an extreme expression of eugenics, and his ideology was deeply inculcated and imprinted predominantly by figures from eugenists in the United States. That is the big smoking gun there. And so when you take this and you put that recipe together, then he started to emerge and take these ideas from the United States that, you know what, you are superior. The Nordic people, man, you are superior. Rise up. You know, you need to expel, you need to segregate these people, you need to sterilize them. They are morally corrupting you. And that's why he wanted to get rid of them. That's what the whole program was about. First, sterilize them. Second, it was about getting rid of them. And then eventually came the final solution, right? Okay, now it's extermination. That's the sad reality behind that. And the reason why it led into that direction is because they began to suspect, and this is always prevalent as well, and I wouldn't be surprised if I did the research, if in the background you have these shadowy forces as usual, but the blame began to be imprinted on the Jewish population. Oh, they were the propagandists. They were the ones controlling the banks. They were the ones controlling the media. And like all good deceptions, there's traces of truth to that. But in all of those instances, in the background, there were also Anglo-Saxon powers that be, right? There were
Anglo-Saxon Jews, you know, yeah.
Well, I mean, just it goes beyond ethnicity and race.
Yeah. But it's just ironic to me that the ones that believed them superior to all the rest were the literal European, the white ones. You know what I mean? I mean, what else can you call them? They were Caucasian.
Yeah,
I mean,
100%.
how ironic.
And exactly. And the thing is, perhaps unconsciously, they were adopting again this unconscious ethos that was being entrenched.
It was like a megaphone from the United States and London. You had conferences going on. You had a huge one. Winston Churchill. Everyone who was anyone was in attendance. And meanwhile, Germany had its people in attendance, and everyone was talking about eugenics. They had a world summit. This is what was going on in the minds of these leaders even back then. The idea of a dominant gene pool and weeding out the lesser people, and most of the time, lesser simply meant people with less money or people of color.
All people that they just
Minorities.
didn't like.
Yeah,
Eugenics experiments were actually first done on poor white people, believe it or not. The
I believe
first
it.
law that was passed in the United States was actually targeted at poor white men.
Wow.
I think it was a white man that was sexually indecent or something ambiguous. I can't remember specifically what it was. And so this ethos, it's just elitism underneath all of it. They try to present it in such a way that they can still divide us against one another.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of promote the narrative, that dominant narrative, that it's the white man. The white man. And the problem with
Right.
that is most white people, like most any human being, are decent people.
Mm-hmm.
And then naturally they may get defensive, but then that gives other people, other ethnicities, a target. But the reality is that the real target's in the background. And what we also know historically is through the work that was done in India, for example, one of the examples that I like to use, because several million people were literally sterilized. Several million people were sterilized as a result of a direct agreement and cooperation between the US government and the Indian government. And of course, in the background was the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the International Planned Parenthood Federation, and the Population Council, and other groups like that. And then China's one child policy was also another
How long ago
expression
was
of
that
it.
in India?
That was, I think, in the 1960s. It went on for a long time, man. It went on for, I
Yeah.
think, over 10 years. And the woman that was in power, her name was Indira Gandhi, if I recall correctly, not any relation to the Mahatma Gandhi that everybody knows. And this woman, the United Nations gave her an award, and it was a co-award. Yeah, it was the United Nations Population Award, their first one ever. Not only
My
did they
God.
give it to her, they gave it to her to share with somebody else. Guess who they gave it to her to share with? It was the person in charge of China's one-child policy.
Oh my God.
Wild,
That
right? But
that
at
is
the
the
United
priority.
Nations, I mean, again, I refer people to the publication I wrote. Everything is in there. And I'm just one more thing, and then we'll move into, I suppose it is all somewhat related. But one of the very significant things, aside from the fact that Hitler was getting these ideas, I mean, remember he called Madison Grant's publication, The Passing of the Great Race, his Bible. He literally referred to it as his Bible. Madison Grant from Wall Street and very tight with the Rockefeller family and all JP Morgan. He was even funded, in fact, by Jacob Schiff, who was a prominent Jew,
Oh
even though
yeah.
Jacob Schiff knew he was anti Semitic, like legitimately. One of the very significant things as well, and uh, numerous historians, this is a mainstream academically recognized and accepted fact. I can actually refer people to Professor Stefan Kuhl's book. He was one of the first to address this. I think it was entitled The Nazi Connection. And he stated that the Rockefeller Foundation, because remember, Germany was in dire straits economically. It was going through a Great Depression. And so the science establishment needed funds. And so what happened? The Rockefeller Foundation swooped in and they guided the science. And where did they guide it to? They guided it towards eugenics. So as Professor Stefan Kuhl notes, and then others have echoed since him, and maybe it was somebody who said it before him, the key factor, the key individual organization behind the rise of eugenics and the guidance of eugenics in Nazi Germany early on was the Rockefeller Foundation.
Yep.
Yeah, and that was done specifically, and this is also interesting, this was done specifically by Abraham Flexner. Abraham Flexner was the guy behind the infamous Flexner Report, and he actually hired a guy who was a Jewish German eugenist. His name was Heinrich Pohl. And Heinrich Pohl they worked together to guide the Rockefeller Foundation's money with the eugenics programs. And of course, they culminated in what we recognize today. I mean, at the
Yeah.
most extreme form, in the Holocaust.
The Holocaust. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a bit of history there for people before we get into the Rothschilds' influence in how they actually served as patrons to Nazi Germany. And
Yeah.
I'm still in the very early stages of unearthing that. But
I
nonetheless,
was
this is
reading
significant.
about 5 meetings that I think it was Paul Warburg. So the Warburg, that if that name sounds familiar, it's also one of the establishing names on the Federal Reserve in the United States.
That's right. Yeah.
But
Paul
I know that
Warburg
there was.
considered the architect of the Federal Reserve Bank.
That's right. And they had, I think, 5 meetings before it was 19. There was 5 meetings on record, and that came from German records. I mean, I think the Warburgs spoke about it, but that's where it was discovered in the archives of one of the German. And I'll find it before we're done. But I was just reading about that too. 5 meetings between the Nazis and the Zionists, and like just to 30-second recap of how. And I also have a question about this, because we know that the economy in Germany was flourishing, right? And then all of a sudden it started to crash. And I've never put the 2 and 2 together, because I've only recently learned about the embargo and the Zionist meeting that was in Amsterdam between the Nazis and the Jews, where the Jews said, listen, either fire that fucking maniac Hitler, or we're going to fucking starve you out. We can stop all exports, and if you can't export, you can't import. And if you can't import, you can't feed yourself. And basically that's what they did. And they did have the power, as we were just saying, to do that to Germany. And Germany was like, okay, Germany had just learned that the reason why they fucking got their asses handed to them in World War I was because of a backdoor deal that their Jews, along with Zionists, did to them, basically backstabbing them and finding a way to bring America into the war, which is what we know they did. And the deal, as I understand it, was, listen, you don't have to surrender just yet. Promise us Palestine, which is where the Balfour Declaration then eventually came into play. But promises Palestine will get America involved. You don't have to give everything away, because up until that point, as far as I understand it, the Jews were for Germany, right? I mean, because they had just left Russia, they were like, fuck those.
Some of the most prominent Jews actually came from Germany, and Jacob Schiff, for example, he had a very strong nationalistic feeling towards like his home country. So a lot of Jews actually loved Germany.
It was very pro-Germany at the time until
very. And it's actually good that you raised that, because that's another massive significant figure. We also did provide a source. It was actually the Rothschilds archive about bringing the United States into the war in a previous podcast. That right there is another reason why now they are incensed, even though it's the elitist Jews, it's the ruling elements, but that's another measure. Oh, that's the Jews. We need to target the Jews, right, for these programs. And then, of course, eugenics and just all of these ideas all come together, they converge. And then, of course, the rest is history.
That's right. And imagine, you had a Germany that was already very, very resentful towards the Jewish population because of what happened in World War I. Then they had a meeting, I think it was in 1934, and they said, either put our people back in power and, try and maybe get rid of that dude with the mustache who can't shut up about the Jews, or you're going to suffer the consequences. And the Germans were like, is that what you think? And then it fucking spun out of control. You know what I'm saying? But listen, you want to see an animal act insane? I don't care if you're talking about a lion or a fucking giraffe or a human being. Go ahead and starve them, and you'll see some insane fucking behavior. And if that's what was going on, I'm not making excuses, but I'm saying that this was the crescendo that built into the Holocaust, and it was a fucking disaster. It was an all-around disaster, but it was all these ideas and resentments coming forward in a way that was just treacherous and tragic.
Look, so I mean, look, I know that I have to research quite a bit of that before I can give a really insightful comment on it and add something to it. But I do know that yes, the economy was in a really bad position. People didn't have work. This is why also Nazi Germany was very attractive to the people because they almost had full employment amongst the country. For the average individual who doesn't have, when you're hungry, as an individual, as a parent, as a father, as a mother, all you want to do is take care of your family. All you want to do is eat. This is introductory survival. So I think people need to take those into consideration. But at the same time, the average German person didn't recognize or understand or know that these programs were taking place, which is why they were so far removed beyond the more populous areas. They were far out in the countryside and so on and so forth, because the average German person didn't know, and scholars have established that. Yes, they were incensed by propaganda through eugenics and that Germans are superior, but that's not synonymous with now advocating mass extermination. That was an elitist element that engaged in that overwhelmingly. And then the common people, much as was true in America or Britain, they supported eugenics in much the same way that so many people during the lockdown supported these obscene measures, these pseudoscientific lockdowns that resulted in literally tens of millions of people dying. I went through this in detail as well when I gave my 2020 presentation. I also explained how back in 2020 already, the United Nations University projected that 500 million people are going to be pushed into poverty.
They did, those motherfuckers. They did.
And
they're so good at that. And then you're saying, can you show us the data you used to put into the program? And they're like, what data? I can't find it.
You're talking about Imperial College London. Yeah, no, that was purely done. It wasn't even published in a peer-reviewed journal, man.
No, it couldn't.
Yeah. But anyways, I suppose let's get into everything. Yeah, let's dig in. And what we're going to do is, remember I was talking about Benito, right? Benito was the company, the oil company, and this was when the Rothschilds were first getting into oil. This was the company that they started to contact. Sorry, I'm just pulling up slides here.
No worries.
That they contacted or gave loans, to Tsar Alexander III. They issued him loans, even though he was heavily persecuting Jews. They gave him these loans, and then these Jews, many of them, this was the earliest colonization and settlements in Palestine, were Jews largely coming from the Russian Empire, overwhelmingly, including the radicals, which I think we addressed in a previous podcast. Now, this company, Benito, they became Royal Dutch Shell. And the way that they became Royal Dutch Shell, okay, can you see that?
Yeah, I'm going to make it bigger so I can see it even more.
Okay, let me also, what I can do, hang on. Well, this publication over here is from Oxford University. So that, this is an establishment as you're going to get. It's called A History of Royal Dutch Shell. And this is page 200. Let's see if I can blow it up. There you go. A History of Royal Dutch Shell. It was published in 2007, and it basically details the history behind Royal Dutch Shell. And when they say the group, they're talking about the Royal Dutch Shell Group, because back then it was actually a series of subsidiaries that were just working together. So you had Royal Dutch, and then you had Shell, and they would later merge, and then also there were different subsidiaries involved. The Rothschilds, of course, were also involved in this. And then so what they did, because if you look this up, the reason why I actually included this slide is when you go and look this up online, what you are going to read about, and it's so dodgy and it's so surreptitious, is that the Rothschild family sold their interests to Royal Dutch Shell. And this is true. They did sell their interests. But what they don't explain is that they sold these interests. So if you see the group agreed to buy out the Rothschilds' interest in Asia Tech of £500,000. And this was a subsidiary involved with Benito. And I'm not going to get into all the semantics of it. People can read it. And then it explains the total came out to be £3.1 million, which was paid in Royal Dutch shares. So now what they did is they actually gave them shares as part of selling to them. So they didn't sell out their shares. And then if you go a little bit further down, we go right here. Okay. And then at the bottom there, it says it ended in a transformation of the Rothschilds from partners into formal shareholders. Okay, so now they become shareholders. Now, if we go to the next source that we have, and this comes directly from the Rothschilds archive, and this is page 24 and page 25, searching for oil, and I think that's Rube, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. And they clarify this further. It says the Rothschilds became Royal Dutch's single biggest shareholder. And they explain that this was done by what I just previously mentioned, when they merged and then they sold their shares in Asiatech. Again, this is related to Benito. And then it says there, at a stroke, the Rothschilds became Royal Dutch's single biggest shareholder. All right, so the significance of this specifically is they are now the biggest shareholders in the company. I don't care what people say. When you are the largest shareholder in a company, you are the one that controls the company.
You're in fucking charge, okay?
Yes, you're the big boy.
Yeah.
And so now, if I encourage people to go look it up, because this will also give you a little bit of insight into how duplicitous they can be. So you go to Wikipedia, look this up. Oh, they sold their shares on this date, very early on. And excuse me, so this naturally absolves them of any potential wrongdoings, because Royal Dutch Shell funded all kinds of dodgy regimes, including fascist regimes such as Franco in Spain. And so this then leads us to the involvement with the Nazi regime. Now, this is actually just starting to emerge now. People aren't actually even fully aware of this history. It's in its early stages. So the first thing is you'll be able to find out about this guy, Sir Henry de Turding. So if you go look him up, they're going to say that he worked with the Nazis and he was a massive proponent of the Nazis. In fact, when he died, they held a huge military kind of celebration for his or commemoration for his death. And so he has now been kind of used as the fall guy, but this was not the primary shareholder. All right, he was just a representative of the company. So we see this is quite recently, 2021, calls for Shell to apologize for fueling, and I quote, the Nazi war machine. And in this book of this is such an interesting little.
Waiting for that apology.
yeah, because it obviously acknowledges wrongdoing on their part. Yeah. And this guy of John Donovan, a very interesting story to look into. The guy that wrote this book is actually a former either chair or executive or director. He worked in some capacity for Royal Dutch Shell, and then something happened where he became disillusioned, and then of course he produced this publication, and he also purchased, it's such a funny story and a testament to the power of the internet, he also purchased a domain, and the domain, let me see if I can actually pull it up. The domain, oh man, please tell me I can pull this up. Of course, Google won't let it come up. Well, anyways, he purchased this domain that seems very much like the official company domain. And so he controls it. And then through this, here we go. Boom. Let me share this with you guys. It's so funny, man. And then through it, no, not that one. Okay, he's got multiple domains, I guess. I don't even know that. Okay, there it is. It's called Royal Dutch Shell PLC.com. Let me bring that up on here. Give you guys a good laugh quickly. All right, there you go. So can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so he owns this website, right? And Royal Dutch Shell, and on this, he's got all of these expositions about the horrible things that Royal Dutch Shell has done over the years. And through this website, Royal Dutch Shell actually tried to take him to court, right? They tried to take him to court and say, look, you can't have that domain.
Yeah.
But this dude obviously knows his stuff. He managed to figure out the legalities, the spider webs and so on, and the red tape, and he's managed to keep the website up there. And so he has this very popular website that people are now going to visit to learn all this dodgy information about, which again, it's a testament to the power of the internet, man.
Right.
And the guy played his hand very, very well. And so the significance here is that what people are going to brush up on, like the first layer, because there's multiple layers of deception. So the first one is what I mentioned. Okay, you go and look it up and say, oh, the Rothschilds sold their share to Royal Dutch Shell in the early 1900s. Okay, end of story.
Yeah.
Nothing more needs to be said about that.
Reminds me of the way the Bushes took care of their Halliburton
stock
before.
It's the same kind of blueprint always, man. History repeats itself. You know, they're not that original in the things that they do. And so if you look into this, specifically as well, the publications that are presented to you, right? And these are mainstream academic publications. They're just kind of giving you the proper history. When people go and look into this, what they will find is that, yes, the Rothschilds did still own the shares during the era of Nazi Germany's rise to power, and also while Nazi Germany was in power. But it was so Henry deterring, so he now becomes the scapegoat guy. Who this dude? He's just an executive. He's just somebody that's working for the company, but he's the main guy, not the primary shareholder. And the Rothschilds, like the Rockefellers, have been manic in terms of their fixation with control. Okay, they are micromanagers. And eventually, this guy gets so overt with his support for the Nazis that they ask him to step down from the board.
Wow.
And this is like in, I don't know, they only did this much later on. Okay. The fact of the matter is, if it was really such an issue, because people were protesting, if there's one thing that gets the ruling class to do something, it's not their good conscience. It's because people are protesting and it is compromising their position of appearing as the good guy or whatever it might be. And so they could have easily dismissed him a long time ago. They could have gotten rid of him. But they let him step down, and if I'm not mistaken, they still gave him a retirement package. So now why I'm mentioning that is because this notion that the Rothschilds were not somehow implicated in this when they are the primary shareholders and they are giving Nazi Germany oil and in fact injecting funds into the political party, including at a time when they were not doing well financially. That's a big deal, because the Rothschilds were a seminal primary influence in the development of Palestine. So that's massive, right? It's a very big deal. The next thing to get into is the Warburg family. The Warburg family, their tentacles are actually so ubiquitous that it's been mentally exhausting looking into it, because it's so
they were fucking good, incessant, one gopher after the next for the banking interests in the Rothschild fucking dynasty. I mean, they were partners in crime every step of the way, as far as I have learned.
Yeah, so they got their major entry. It's an interesting family. Okay, so this is the five Warburg brothers that are best known, but they have a very broad network, and they actually precede the Rothschild family in terms of their longevity. So they have been traced by historians to go back all the way to the 15 or 1400s in Italy. They were a prominent banking family, which is very interesting, right? This is such a long time ago. And so they are really an international network of the family, and they've been profoundly influenced. So the guy in the bottom left that we're looking at now, that's Paul Warburg. Okay, so Paul Warburg, he's recognized now as being like the brain behind the development of the Federal Reserve Bank. He's like the architect of the Federal Reserve Bank. He was also a founding member. He was, in fact, the founding chair of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is also massive. That's a very, very big deal. Then at the top there above him, that's his brother Felix Warburg. They look very similar, as you can see. And Felix Warburg, he was involved in Palestine. I'm going to get into that in a moment. In the middle, that's Max Warburg. Now, Max Warburg, he was actually the brother that served as an advisor to the Kaiser during the First World War, and he sat on the private central bank of the Reichsbank.
Wow.
Okay, which is also very, very significant. So he sat on the Reichsbank, which is the equivalent of the Federal Reserve, but in Germany. And then the other two brothers there are not as significant. The one is Abraham Warburg. He was like into art, and then the one at the top on the right is Fritz Warburg. Well, look, the reality is, because I did this with the Rockefeller family in the past, where I thought like Lawrence Rockefeller wasn't that significant. They probably are very significant. I probably just haven't discovered as to why.
That's true. And
okay.
Those people in their own right, by being the black, Lawrence Rockefeller did a lot of good. He would have done more probably if his family didn't tell him to shut the fuck up, or we'll have to take care of you.
Well, I mean, look, there's a lot to be said about Lawrence Rockefeller, and I suppose we could do a podcast on that. But he was actually a primary figure in the weaponization of environmentalism. Yeah.
Wow.
Big boy, man. Big boy. He advised about a dozen presidential administrations spanning from Dwight D. Eisenhower all the way up to Barack Obama in the background on environmental policy. He's the only environmentalist to be awarded, I think it was the Congressional Medal of Honor, if I recall correctly. Big time mover. And he founded, alongside Madison Grant's brother, DeForest Grant, And Henry Fairfield Osborne Jr., which was his father was Henry Fairfield Osborne Sr., which was Madison Grant's best friend, and they founded the American Eugenics Society together. They founded this organization called the Conservation Foundation in 1948. The Conservation Foundation played the seminal, massive role in weaponizing environmentalism, and they were the first to develop nature documentaries. They started to insert nature, but where people at central to it, that the world is overpopulated. They started to insert this into the education curriculum, elementary schools, high schools, universities. It's crazy, man. I also addressed that in my publication. It's so wild. And then later on, in 1990, the reason why you don't hear about the Conservation Foundation now, you're like, okay, what is that?
Yeah.
They merged with the World Wildlife Fund. Who was the World Wildlife Fund founded? It was founded by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, a former Nazi SS official, Godfrey Rockefeller, and the British Eugenics Society chair and life fellow, Julian Huxley. And then also, sorry, the last guy as well, that was also a co-founder of it was, what was that dude's name that was married to the Queen of England that just died? Prince. You know that
Charles?
dude, man. No, not Charles. That dude, I can't remember his name now, but he was also a founding member. I'm sure people know who I'm talking about. Like, he looks like an actual zombie or Dracula or something. Like, he looks like I don't think he's around anymore, but he was also involved, and two of his sisters were married to high-profile Nazis, high-ranking Nazi figures. Yeah. So there's a lot to be said about all of that, man. It's a very interesting topic that I would like to actually broach one of these days. But if you don't have any questions, I'll climb into like this crazy influence of the Warburg family, man.
Let's climb into it. The only thing I know about Lawrence Rockefeller was that he seemed to be earnestly. I didn't know that he was one of the people who had concocted and realized the power that to bring the world under a single government rule using environmental doomsday scenarios and start the propaganda arm.
Like I said, I didn't know that either, because it's very hush hush.
The only thing I knew about Lawrence was that he was very for the disclosure of a lot of the UFO cover up that's been going on. Now, again, maybe he didn't quite realize that would have been at the expense of the oil interests that he had also. But when you have so much money, it's hard to give a shit about.
Look, they're sneaky, man. That's all I know, is that they are sneaky, and they all play significant roles, man. It's so interesting. So even now with the Warburg family, I'm like, oh, they're not important. They probably are really important. I just don't realize it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump back into it, because it's so crazy. I'm actually glad I got some slides, because to try and where is this now? There it is. Okay, so let's start with Paul Warburg. Okay, now we're jumping right into it, Joe. This is from Professor Anthony Sutton's publication, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. This is page 110. And again, I like to explain to people where the source of their knowledge and their information and that proverbial food is coming from. Professor Anthony Sutton, prior to his more explosive publications, he was an academic. He was working at Hoover Institute, and he wasn't just an academic. He was considered one of the foremost. He was actually, in fact, recommended by the National Security Advisor Zbigniew Zabriskie in his book called Between Two Ages, where he called his research very impressive, because he basically showed with the receipts down to the smallest details. I mean, his scholarship it's airtight. It is so assiduous. And he demonstrated how Wall Street had built up the Soviet Union, and prior to that, Communist Russia. And then also the Council on Foreign Relations recommended his reading. Now, this is, of course, prior to when he started to become a bit more outspoken about what's really going on. But nonetheless, it's significant, right? It shows that he's a reliable source. And so you can go to this publication. You can find it online, archive.org. And what he's showing here, as you can see at the very top, financial contributions that were made to Hitler. 23rd March 1933. And who do we see at the second from the top? So 30.5% of the total funds came from an organization called IG Farben Industry. But this was the branch specifically that Paul Warburg worked for. And you see over there the name Edsel Ford. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
And Walter Teagle. All right, the significance of that is Edsel Ford. Obviously, that's Henry Ford's son. Henry Ford was like a hero for Hitler. He allegedly had a portrait of him. He read his literature. We all know now that Henry Ford was like legitimately anti-Semitic.
Yeah, outspoken. Yeah.
Big time, big time. And the Ford Motor Company was massive in their patronage and their financial support of Nazi Germany. And then Walter Teagle, he was from Standard Oil. Standard Oil, above and beyond all other corporations and companies in the Rockefeller network, he was a representative of Walter Teagle of Standard Oil. He, likewise, they were major patrons, massive. They gave him the fuel, they gave him the technological know-how, everything in Nazi Germany. And then who do we see? We see Paul Warburg, right? The founding chair of the Council on Foreign Relations and a key figure in, of course, the Warburg family and the architect of the Federal Reserve Bank. And let me just quickly, I just wanted to include that so people don't have to blindly rely on what I'm saying. Okay. I actually personally cut this publication here. It's excellent resource for those who are researchers. Go to newspaper.com, I think it is. All right. So anyways, as you can see, and this was actually, as you see, there's Senator Truman. That's the future President Truman.
Mm-hmm.
And he called what they did treason. And this did result in a fine. It was a very small fine. It's quite interesting. The representative of the government went to them and basically said, we're going to slap you with this massive fine. And they kind of scoffed at him and they said, no, we're going to give you this amount and you're going to take it and you're going to keep quiet. And that's the end of the story. And that's what happened. Like literally, they had to pay, I think it was like $10,000 or something, just totally obscene. Just an insult. And that's clearly what it was meant to be. And then on the other side, Walter Teagle, you can actually go look up Walter Teagle, even on Wikipedia, and it will show that he worked with the Nazis and so on. But again, he's like a fall guy, all right? Mm-hmm. And then we see also more recently, this was in 1999, Nazi documents reveal that Ford had links to Auschwitz.
No shit.
And I go again into great detail in my publication, but yes, so they worked very clearly. And the significance there is he's sharing this board with these figures, Edsel Ford and Walter Teagle. So that's the Ford motor car company and then Standard Oil, both of whom were financing Nazi Germany. And I say this because it's actually quite hard to discover the full extent of the Warburgs' influence in Nazi Germany. So here we go to page 110, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. They explain that Max Warburg was also a director of IG Farben. So Paul Warburg, was on IG Farben America. His brother Max Warburg was in IG Farben in Germany. The significance here that people need to look up and understand, because we don't really get this context, is IG Farben was Nazi Germany. Hitler would never have existed or been able to do anything in relation to going to war without IG Farben. And IG Farben wouldn't be able to do anything without Standard Oil. They were, in fact, one of Standard Oil's biggest shareholders behind the Rockefeller family. And people can go look this up. Now, when you do look it up, they're going to make it appear as though, they were hijacked by the Nazis. No, they were with the Nazis from the beginning. They were the same thing. IG Farben was the Nazis. Nazis was IG Farben. One and the same thing. Now, as you can see, Professor Sutton explains here that 3 board members of American IG Farben were found guilty at the Nuremberg war crime trials. And then he explains who those figures were. These were all Germans. So they had actual Nazis working in the American IG Farben organization. And then, of course, IG Farben in Germany was overwhelmingly made up of Nazi leadership. But then he explains American board members, Edsel Ford, C.E. Mitchell, who was also actually involved with the Federal Reserve, Walter Teagle, and Paul Warburg were not placed on trial in Nuremberg. And then they say they were not even questioned about their knowledge of the 1933 Hitler Fund, which we've already qualified as. But
isn't Warburg a Jewish last name?
Oh, 100%. No, they are. They're Jews, man. Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Just so we're all clear about what we're discussing, the Warburgs, IG Farben was a staple. Was it? I mean, like Gavin
they manufactured the Zyklon B. They were instrumental in the exterminations.
The gas chambers. I mean, all the experimentation. They were. You cannot separate the Nazi war machine from IG Farben because
it's one and the same thing. It is the war machine.
That's right. So
they produced like something crazy, like 90% of the materials, all the materials, the fuel. That's right. I mean, everything. It was wild.
The,
And
the
another very
beginning of
interesting
the
thing
death
is,
cult that we still see manifesting today in our society, that is the pharmaceutical industry, which is basically the
well, it was a
bastard child
pharmaceutical company.
of a
Yeah,
chemical. Yeah, I mean, it was a chemical company, pharmaceutical company, but
pharmaceutical slash chemical company, and
absolutely.
its subsidiaries after the war, BASF,
Hmm.
Bayer, and others, which continue to this very day and
Right.
continue to be implicated in horrible, horrible things. In fact, Professor Shauna Swan, who cites the sterilization fertility crisis that
Yep.
we face with, she views them and she notes them as being primary culprits. And not just views them, I mean, this is based on scientific research.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those
And she's
chemicals are
dedicated
making
her
people
life to it.
infertile. What was eugenics about, boys and girls? Infertility.
Hello.
Exactly.
Chemical castration. People think that what's going on is an accident, and it's not. It's not
No,
an
it's not an
accident.
accident. It's a calculated policy. And that's what again, in the publication I wrote, I go into detail about that. How methodical, how undeniable they conspired
Hmm.
about this on every single level. And also in the wake of World War II, with John J. McCloy, a Rockefeller Foundation official, a former chair of the Council on Foreign Relations, a big boy in the elitist establishment, he became the High Commissioner to Germany, and he infamously absolved about 24 high-profile Nazi war criminals
That's
of their
right.
crimes. And what did a few of these guys do? They went straight back to work in leadership positions in Bayer and BASF.
Wow.
So why would the policy not change? In all likelihood, it would very much stay the
Yeah.
same. And so, getting back to this with the Warburg influence, and because I also want to demonstrate for people to understand their role in Palestine, because they played a very big role in Palestine. Then they had a cousin, this guy Otto Heinrich Warburg. He actually stayed in Nazi Germany, and he was given special privileges, and he was allowed to stay there. And he was a Nobel Prize winner. He was a brilliant um, uh, physicist, if I'm correct, a
Hmm.
doctor. And he's a distant cousin, but nonetheless, it's worth mentioning. Then another guy, James Lube. James Lube was actually the brother-in-law of Paul Warburg. So a very interesting organization to look into, man, is um, Kuhn Lube and Company.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Huge.
yeah. Kuhn Lube and Company, man. The intermarrying between powerful families, and then if you just follow it further and further, it all of these powerful families are intermarrying.
But they were
So the
also
Solomon
Jewish
family.
bankers to Germany, to the Nazi Party, and to Hitler for a long time. Were they not? Am
I don't know about
I
that.
think
I
I
don't know
was
about
reading
that. I,
that.
I wouldn't say that it's impossible.
I'll have to
The
look
thing
into
is,
that.
what we need to know is the moment that they're funding the Nazis, that's significant enough, right?
Yeah.
That's massive. That's even more significant than just being a party member, because now you are actually the one that is allowing them to
Sponsoring,
exist,
sponsoring,
100%.
right?
And so, what makes James Lube significant, and you can even find this on Wikipedia, is that this dude, he was actually a major patron of eugenics as well, alongside the Rockefeller Foundation. Specifically, you can see this is actually from Wikipedia. He donated a large amount of funds to what is now called the Max Planck Institute of Psychiatry. What they don't elaborate on, back then it was actually called the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Psychiatry. Is this what became the heart of the eugenics program in Nazi Germany? And he died in 1933, but his estate continued to fund this program until 1940. So the World War II was already raging, and funds are still being dedicated from his
Wow.
estate, from his family members, to this program. And there you see who took over the institute, a guy by the name of Ernst Rudin, who was a major figure in Nazi Germany. Okay, so what we've laid out here very clearly is this massive patronage and support for Nazi Germany. There it is.
Hmm.
It's indisputable. It's incontrovertible. And for those who want to dig a little bit deeper, because you may not be familiar with Professor Anthony Sutton, go check it out for yourself. He is so meticulous. That list that I showed people now, he provides the original document in German, and then he explains the translation.
Wow.
Like, he does not play around there, dude. He's a proper old school, real deal scholar. So now we've established how they were working in Nazi Germany. Let's also now explore their major, massive influence, which is very quiet. You don't know much about this today, but their massive influence also in Palestine. So this guy over here, Otto Warburg, who was their cousin, they were relatively close with him. I'm talking about the five Warburg brothers, so they were close with this dude. For example,
Hmm.
Otto Warburg and I think it was Max Warburg were both part of the German Zionist organization. And anyways, he became the president of the World Zionist Organization. Now, what makes him especially significant is in our previous podcast when we spoke about Arthur Rupin, and Arthur Rupin presiding over the Palestinian Land Development Company, the PLDC, and of course Arthur Rupin being an infamous eugenist and an Ashkenazi supremacist. Otto Warburg was actually the one that appointed him to his position. So that's also very significant. Now we get into the Palestine Economic Corporation. All right, the Palestine Economic Corporation, which was another one of the five brothers. So we spoke about Paul, we spoke about Max, we spoke about both of the cousins, Otto and Otto Heinrich. Now we're talking about Frederick Warburg. And he played a massive role in this company called the Palestine Economic Corporation. And this is a company that very little is spoken about, but they played a massive role in both extracting resources and investing in the land. So you may recall, and I think it was a previous podcast, we went into the massive amounts of wealth that are contained.
Fucking August 28th, 1927.
Yep.
And the headline reads, Dead Sea to yield trillion in riches. In 1927, it said that.
Yep.
Wow.
Which is mind-blowing. I know. That is just insanely mind-blowing. And who do we see over here? We see the Palestine Economic Corporation. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead there. So the Dead Sea to yield trillions in riches, and essentially the company that got the contract, that got the concession to exploit the resources from there. See, it says Warburg reports on development in Palestine. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
And then it says achievements of the Palestine Economic Corporation in the development of Jewish Palestine, where it has been seen of vital assistance to every phase of its upbuilding, and the vast potentialities inherent in the Dead Sea concessions. Now, what makes this also very, very interesting, right? Apart from the obvious. So now we have the Warburg family also involved in massive exploitation of the resources. We also get this very interesting connection. You see at the bottom there, I've got, I don't know if you can see it, it does not look small. Bernard Flexner. Okay. Bernard Flexner. Now remember earlier I was speaking a little bit about how in Germany the science there was guided by the Rockefeller Foundation and a guy by the name of Abraham Flexner, the dude that was behind the Flexner Report that essentially outlawed more alternative practices of medicine in favor of what today is obviously a very controversial pharmaceutical based system. Okay. Abraham Flexner's brother was Bernard Flexner. So Abraham Flexner was guiding the eugenics program in Germany with Rockefeller Foundation sponsorship. And then we have this, and of course the Rockefellers are major, more than any other family I know of in Nazi Germany, were they massively influential. And then on the other end, we have the Warburg family, and through this Palestine Economic Corporation, which Felix Warburg was a vice president, the president of that is Bernard Flexner, who is Abraham Flexner's brother. To me, that's very significant. Christ. Yes, because he was guiding the eugenics programs in Germany. So it's quite a bit to wrap your head around, but you can kind of see something doesn't smell right. Yeah, there's something very
poisonous
sneaky.
Tentacles are taking fucking hold at every end.
Yeah, that's why people they think it's a joke how well coordinated these people are and how entrenched their spider web is. It goes even beyond what I've uncovered. It's just the beginning. And then this is the last slide. I didn't have time, unfortunately, to put more together. But this is in relation to the transfer agreement, right? As I said, there were powerful Zionists that were actually trying to throttle the boycott, the international boycott. So what do we see here? We see Hamburg banker Eric Warburg cabled his cousin Frederick in New York. Now, Eric Warburg is the son of Max Warburg. Frederick is the son of Paul Warburg. And what he does is he cables him and he says, look, you see it over here, they need to disavow atrocity stories and any boycott. So you cannot talk about the atrocities that are going on in Germany anymore. You have to issue a statement. So what happens? Frederick, he contacts a guy by the name of Morris Waldman. Morris Waldman approves a statement that says, and I quote, "The American Jewish Committee declares that, to its knowledge, most of the so-called atrocity stories which were reported from Germany to have appeared in the American press did not so appear. No threats of boycott in America have been made by any responsible Jewish bodies." So yeah, we also have on this other end,
So wait,
they,
let me let's
yeah,
let
I
me
know.
can explain to me what was happening, because I went from understanding the embargo, and now is this a communication between explain this to me, what's going on, because I'm a little lost.
Okay, cool. No, I know it's so confusing. It's mentally exhausting, man. So now this is specifically to do with when the boycott is going on, and the transfer agreement is trying to be put through as well by the Zionists, so they can get the
Right.
capital from Germany into the country. And so, as a
Oh,
result of the
so wait a minute.
boycott,
So wait a minute. So the the Zionists, are you saying that they were at the same time that they were putting forth this embargo, they were quietly also trying to strong arm the
counter.
Germans into the transfer of Jews into Palestine?
So what they were doing is they were actually trying to thwart and throttle, and not just trying, they did it. They successfully did it, to thwart and undermine and eliminate the Jewish boycott that was going on internationally of Nazi Germany. So what he was mentioning there, he said,
Oh,
you need to issue a press statement right now that there's no atrocity proper, that there aren't horrible persecutions going on against Jews, because it's gonna incense and upset the German administration. So they're
mm-hmm.
essentially asking them to lie. They're saying, look, you need to keep it
Yeah.
hush hush. Now, the author of this publication, which is Edwin Black, it's called The Transfer Agreement. There's some really good information there. But the guy, he's a Jew and he's a raging Zionist. So the way he tries to frame it is that they didn't want to engage in a boycott because they were fearful what was going to happen to the Jews in Nazi Germany. That's the way he tries to frame it, right? and look, he's an otherwise really good historian, but his tribalism is
Yeah, he's
really
probably biased.
irrational and powerful, man. Like he basically says that people that engage in a boycott of Israel in the modern sense are anti-Semitic. Look, that's all it is. There could be no other logical reason.
Right.
But I'm not somebody that throws the baby out with the bathwater. I can
No, you're
appreciate the
smart.
fact that he can still do meticulous research, and he does so.
Mm-hmm.
So what we see here now, right, with all of that considered, is we have a massive effort, and I'm sure the Rothschilds, it still goes beyond that. Also, by the way, Kuhn Lubin Company, they were massively involved. Again, the Palestine Economic Corporation as well. They were massively involved and instrumental in every single moving part of the Palestinian economy, in the development, in injecting funds there, in extracting wealth out of there, in settling the settlements. And it's so interesting because if I encourage people, go research that organization. They don't have a Wikipedia page or anything. It's a very
Mm-hmm.
little known organization, and yet it's one of the major forces behind all of it. And
And listen to its title. You know, if you were to just read the title, you might think that it was something that was put in place for the Palestinian people, but
oh yeah, 100%.
that's not what it was. It's like the Federal Reserve. You know, it was not. It's nothing federal
Nothing
about it.
federal about it. That's
You
right.
know, nothing really Palestinian besides the fact that they're going to be pillaging the resources of Palestine. But it was
Oh,
all
100%,
for,
man.
Jewish interests,
Look,
Zionist interests, I should say. Yeah.
there was also something set up in the region. This was shortly after the San Remo conference, I think in 1920, somewhere around there. And there was the Turkish Petroleum Company. There was nothing Turkish about this petroleum company. It was made up of Royal Dutch Shell. It was made
Yeah.
up of BP. Standard Oil came later on. And what were they doing? They were extracting the natural resources, the oil, from Palestine. That was the plan. And then later on, it changed its name to what? The IPC, the Iraq Petroleum Company. Nothing Iraqi about it.
No.
So, I mean, that's just kind of how they operate, man. The wolf in sheep's clothing. But so that gives people an idea of the fact that, yes, you can see high level, high profile Jews that put forward the imagery of being Zionists, of caring for their fellow Jewish people, were out there literally supporting in instrumental, pivotal ways Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
And this is still very much in its early stages. I would like to encourage people, because I'm somebody that engages in Original research. I like to dig up stuff that has never been dug up before. Unfortunately, it can be very painstaking
Yeah.
because it's essentially mapping out a territory in the proverbial jungle where there is no path. So,
Right.
what I encourage anybody who is listening to this as a researcher, there is a gold mine of information in relation to this particular topic. It just needs people who are willing to dig their hands into the soil of all of this and kind of pick it apart and figure out what precisely has gone on in its totality. Because, like I said, even that Flexner, you get three Flexner brothers. You actually get Abraham Flexner,
Mm-hmm.
who was in charge of the Rockefeller Foundation funds, and he was a key force behind the raping of the medical establishment and
Yeah.
withholding alternative practices from us. Then you get the one we just mentioned as well, Bernard Flexner, Bernard Flexner, a very interesting character. He was a Zionist. He was involved with a Palestinian Economic Corporation and other institutions. I can't remember now off the top of my head. And then there was another one still. And the other one was Simon Flexner. Simon Flexner worked for the Rockefeller Institute. He was a personal friend and advisor to John D. Rockefeller Jr. And remember, John D. Rockefeller Jr. was the greatest patron, arguably, of eugenics programs worldwide at this time. Deep,
Mm.
deep pockets, and also social engineering. And this guy was a personal advisor to him. And he worked at the Rockefeller Institute. Well, what's very interesting is he was the mentor to two particular significant figures. The one was Cornelius P. Rhodes, who was also a Rockefeller Institute employee. This
Mm-hmm.
guy went to Puerto Rico, and there was an infamous letter that he was going to write, and he didn't send it. And one of his co-workers discovered it, where he spoke about how he was infecting Puerto Ricans with cancer. He was
That's
injecting
right.
them with cancer. The other guy was Hideo Noguchi. Hideo Noguchi um, injected more than 140 people with syphilis, including children and orphans as young as 2 years old.
Jesus.
And this is what the Rockefeller Foundation has been about for a long time. You know, even with the so-called pandemic, everyone, oh, the Gates Foundation. In the background is the Rockefeller Foundation.
Of course.
Yeah, the Gates Foundation is just a new vehicle for a very, very old movement,
That's
essentially.
right.
But I mean, when you see all of these forces, although I haven't gotten the entire picture, there's enough there to say, this is something
Fucking
really dodgy
something's
is
rotten
going
in
on.
Denmark. Fucking,
100%,
you know,
hundred
it's
percent, man. So with all of that said, do you have any questions in particular?
man. I think you answered most of them. I love what we've gone over and what we've brought up because it gives people a lot of very strong, you know, foundation to if you are truly interested. You have names, you have sources, you can go out, and if you are interested in the truth of anything we have said, you absolutely have the ability to go out and find it and discern for yourself and sift through it. If you're interested, if you
And
truly want to
potentially
know,
expand on it. And
and
potentially expand
expand
on
on it,
it.
because
Yeah.
there's always more. And man, if you want to understand the world today and what's happening, then you need to understand actual objective history, not fucking textbooks printed for and in Israel for Israelis. Look, I have a lot of friends who are Jewish. I have friends who live in Israel who I was, worried about their safety. And I know how sheltered some of them are, and I know how good hearted most of them are. And
100%.
I have love for the Jewish people as well as I do Catholics and Muslims. This is not about the dehumanization of any people. We're talking about, as usual, the so-called elites and the parasitic class, as Gavin so aptly calls them. These people, they use these religions and ethnicities and anything to hide behind, to pull off their fucking capers, because they're thieves and they don't mind murdering in the process. So I just want to make that clear, and I have no animosity towards any people on this planet. I do get passionate and excited about these double crossing and diabolical fucking dealings that go on, because they are at the expense of all of us.
And it's evil. I mean,
It
if anything
is.
can be called evil, that kind of shit is evil because it's so calculated and it's so intelligent.
And
You
it's
know, when
fucking
somebody does
psychopathic.
something, completely. When somebody
Yeah.
does something out of, let's say, the motivation for survival, as opposed to you doing something evil from a place of abundant knowledge, abundant
Hmm.
finances, you don't need to be doing this. It's just because you are a sick fuck. There's a
Exactly.
problem with that.
I agree. Yeah. And that's an
Yeah.
indoctrination from their little years and when they were fucking small. And that's the biggest
It's
problem
so
is,
hard to understand their
you know,
ways, man, because they've made our lives transparent with social media. They know us better than we know ourselves, which is one of
yeah,
the tenets of the art of war: know your enemy. Whereas we know very little about them. We get
right.
glimpses of their creepy occult rituals, but we know very little about them.
Yeah.
And so, part of what we do now is to kind of set and roll out the carpet for the future generations to dig into this more, so that we can know our enemy and know
Yeah.
what the best course of action to take is to create a better humanity for everyone, rather
Hmm.
than the continuation of this prison planet system that only
Yeah.
benefits this few.
Amen to that, brother. That's why I love these conversations. That's why I love having you on, because as usual, your work is just impeccable. And I know how much time and how frustrating it can be as you assimilate more and more information that makes you want to just face palm yourself in the head, knowing that this has gone on and that this is what we were told. And then you learn, like, but this is what happened. You're like, motherfucker, it can
We've been
be,
gaslit.
yeah,
That's it. We've been
it's,
gaslit, and that's the methodology of a psychopath.
yeah,
Gaslight
basically.
people.
That's it. And so I want to thank you once again for your time, your work, man. And it does not go unnoticed. I'm encouraging everyone to check out the link in the description of this video or wherever you're watching it or listening to it. Check out Gavin's book. It is awesome. I have read it. I was probably one of the first people to read it, and I use it as a source, and I use it as a reference because it's filled with references, and things that I like to talk about and I make videos about. So, if you follow me, you'll definitely enjoy this book. It's jaw dropping. So I encourage you to do that. Follow Gavin on Instagram, and he's also on Patreon. You'll find his links as usual contained in the body of my email. And yeah, brother, thank you again for your time, man. Always,
Thanks for having me, brother.
we'll see what's going on with all this, and you keep me posted how you're doing over there. And you're gonna have a great day today. I'm wishing
And
you
you
all
have
the
yourself a
best,
good sleep, man.
and I'm gonna have a good night's sleep. All right, brother.
100%. All right,
Thank you
brother.
so
Love you,
much.
man.
Love
Be
you too,
easy,
pal.
and we'll be in touch.